So today we are going to continue with our class on the Buddha and his Dhamma. And before we begin, we will chant our traditional Pali text. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, so today we are going to look at this book 1 and part 5 and section 3. And this section relates to what we have been discussing so far about the contemporaries of the Buddha. And here the contemporaries of the Buddha includes the Vedic philosophers and other philosophers that we will be looking at in this section. Today we are going to look at a very important part of the Buddha and his Dhamma, particularly this section called the Brahmanas. Now, these Brahmanas are the books like the Vedas. In fact, they are the part of the Vedas, and they are together with the Vedas are held as the sacred books. And the common name for two of them is Shruti. So if people call about Smruti and Shruti, so the word Shruti means Vedas plus Brahmanas. So according to Babasaheb Ambedkar, the kind of thesis on which these Brahmanas are resting on, they are basically 4 theses. And we have to understand these 4 theses that the Brahmanas include. Now, Brahmanas are the religious texts, and they are the part of the Vedas, and together with the Vedas, they are called a Shruti. And there are the 4 important theses on which the Brahminic philosophy rested. And I think we have to understand this very carefully. So what is the first thesis? The first thesis of the Brahmanas and the Vedic philosophy is this, that the Vedas are not only sacred, but also they are infallible. They are not to be questioned. So the Vedas are the religious texts that you can never question. You have to accept the infallibility, that they are correct. There is nothing that you can add on to, because everything there, whatever is included in the Vedas, has come from the divine sources. And because it has come from the divine sources, they are unquestionable. So you cannot question them. That is the first tenet, that the Vedas are not only sacred, but are also infallible, and they are not to be questioned. That is the first thesis of the Brahminic philosophy. The second thesis of the Brahminic philosophy is this, that there is the salvation of soul, because the soul, according to the Brahminic philosophy, goes from one body to another body, it transmigrates, and that transmigration can be stopped only by the Vedic sacrifices, number 1. Number 2, observances of religious rites and ceremonies, and offering of gifts to Brahmins. So suppose if you want to escape this so-called samsara, then the only way for you is to sacrifice. Animal sacrifice, fire sacrifice, and there were also the human sacrifice, and so on and so forth. And also there are religious rites and ceremonies that have to be observed, and then offering gifts to the Brahmins. That is the third of the second thesis. So now this is about the religious part of it. Babasaheb Ambedkar further goes and says that the Brahminic philosophy not only included so-called religion, but also the thesis for the ideal society. Now let's look at what is the ideal society according to the Brahminical philosophy. So according to Brahminical philosophy, the society has to be modeled on what is called the Chaturvarna. That is the third thesis. Okay. And this idea of Chaturvarna is embedded in the Vedas, as the Vedas are infallible and their authority cannot be questioned. So also Chaturvarna as a pattern of society was binding and unquestionable. If you look at the modern writers of Hinduism, they would go and defending the same thesis again and again, the Chaturvarna being the part of the immutable, sacred, infallible Vedas, that the Chaturvarna cannot be questioned. Okay. Now, this is the third tenet. Now, what is the Chaturvarna? We all know, but we are going to look at and discuss it. So what we are going to look at is this, what is this Chaturvarna? The first rule of the Chaturvarna is this, that there will be 4 classes. So the 4 classes we know: Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas and Shudras. And then there is a second rule which says that there cannot be social equality among these 4 classes. They must be bound together by the rule of graded inequality. So that is the second rule of the third thesis of the Brahmanic philosophy. Then there is a description of the 4 classes. They are not equal in any manner. There is a graded, there are graded rights, there are graded privileges. This Babasaheb Ambedkar has called the rule of graded inequality. Okay. Now we know that the Brahmins had all the rights and privileges which he wished to claim, but a Kshatriya could claim the rights and privileges which a Brahmin could not claim. So you see, the rights and privileges are also graded according to this Brahmanical injunction in the Chaturvarna. The third rule of the Chaturvarna is also about division of occupation, where the occupation of the Brahmin was to learn and teach and perform the religious observances, and the occupation of the Kshatriya was fighting. Trade was assigned to Vaishyas. The occupation of the Shudras was service of the 3 superior classes. Very, I would say, a succinct and a clear description of what is Chaturvarna. If you read this part of the Buddha and his Dhamma, you can argue with anybody on the Brahmanical philosophy. You can argue, their first tenet, their first thesis is that the Vedas are not only sacred but infallible. You cannot question them; they are questionable. Whatever they say, you have to accept it as a truth. And in the Indic philosophical language, it's called Veda Pramanya. So Veda Pramanya is held to be the highest sort of truth. The second, we have seen that sacrifice, that only way you can escape this transmigration of soul, only by practicing the Vedic rites and the sacrifices. And the third was the ideal society of Chaturvarna, which was, because it is a part of Vedas, it's unquestionable. You cannot question it. So now we were seeing the rules of the Chaturvarna. Let's go to the rule 4th, right to education. Okay, only the 3 classes had the right to education. Brahmin, Kshatriya and Vaishya. Shudra didn't have the right of education. And the 5th rule of the Chaturvarna was that the man's life is divided into 4 ashramas. And we know these 4 ashramas. The first was Brahmacharya, the second was Grihasthashram, the third was Sannyasa, and the last is about Vanaprastha, and the last is Sannyasa. Now, for the object of the first stage was study and education. The object of the second stage was to live a married life. The object of the third stage to familiarize a man with the life of a hermit, but without deserting his home. And finally, enable a man to go in search of God, seek union with him. Now, that is why it is called Varnashrama Dharma. So 4 Varnas and 4 Ashramas. Now, the benefits of these stages were open only to the male members of the 3 superior classes. The first stage was not open to Shudras and women. Equally, the last stage was not open to Shudras and women. So out of these 4 ashramas that the Brahmanic philosophy prescribed, the first, like Brahmacharya, and the last, that is called Sannyasa, was not open to the women and the Shudras. Okay, that is the third thesis of the Brahmanical philosophy, and there were 5 rules. Now, the 4th thesis of the Brahmanic philosophy was doctrine of karma. It was part of the thesis of transmigration of the soul. The karma of the Brahmins was an answer to the question, where did the soul land on transmigration with his new body or new birth? The answer of the Brahmanic philosophy was that it depended on man's deeds in his past life. In other words, it depended on his karma. Okay. Now we have seen these 4 theses of the Brahmanic philosophy. I'm going to repeat it recapitulate it, that according to Brahmanic philosophy, the first tenet or the thesis was this, that the Vedas are sacred, not only sacred, they are infallible, they cannot be questioned. That's number one. Number two is if you want to escape the transmigration of soul, the samsara, the only way by which you can do is by practicing the Vedic sacrifices, by conducting certain rituals and offering donations to the Brahmins. That was the second thesis of the Brahmanic philosophy. The third was the Chaturvarna Dharma, because it's part of the Vedas, it's infallible and it is also not questionable. And there are 5 rules of the Chaturvarna that we have seen, that there will be the 4 Varnas, Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, and then they will be arranged according to the graded. The word invented by Baba Ambedkar is graded inequality. And then they their occupations will be different. They will have some of the classes will not have, like Shudras will not have right to education, and only the 3 Varnas and men can practice in all the ashramas, and the women and the Shudras cannot participate in Brahmacharya and Sannyas. So that was the 5th rule of the 3rd tenet of the Brahmanic philosophy. And the 4th was that the doctrine of karma, which is part of the transmigration of the soul, that you do your caste duties and you might be born next life in the higher varnas. That is like how it was. And this summarizes the Brahmanic philosophy. Now, going back to what was the Buddha's criticism of that, and I think that's very important for us to understand. The Buddha was strongly opposed to the first tenet of Brahmanism. He repudiated their thesis that the Vedas are infallible and their authority could never be questioned. In his opinion, now listen very carefully, in his opinion, nothing was infallible and nothing could be final. Now, these very small lines, they actually capture the spirit of Buddhism, that a Buddhist mind should be always open and exploratory. We cannot take anything granted forever. Whatever knowledge we have today, it is bound to change with the understanding, with knowing more about that object. So for example, if we look at the stone, for some people, it might be a stone. For a geologist, it might be an object of inquiry. For a chemist, something else. And for the archaeologist, it might yield him some kind of a historical information. So you see, and if you are a physicist or physicist, you are trying to know the molecular structure of it, the pattern of the arrangement of the molecules. If you are a particle physicist, if you want to know the nature of the particles, the same stone differs, it depending on the way you want to seek the meaning out of it. So what the Buddha is saying, I think is very important. And this is like, if you compare the Brahmanical philosophy, which is like stagnant, no development, because it says that whatever there is, it's a final truth. It is not, it cannot be questioned. While what Buddha says, that everything needs to be questioned. Nothing was infallible and nothing could be final. Everything must be open to re-examination and reconsideration whenever grounds for re-examination and reconsideration arise. So, everything, whatever that is, that should be subjected to, open to re-examination and reconsideration. I think this verse 21 and 21 and 22 are very important. So let's look at the verse 22. Man must know the truth and real truth. Now, as a human being, we should know the truth and real truth. To him, freedom of thought was the most essential thing. So if you ask people not to think, then your freedom of thinking, freedom of expression goes for a toss. Okay, so what the Buddha will ask us to do to have this freedom of thought, and what Baba Ambedkar has said here in the verse number 22, to him freedom of thought was the most essential thing. To be able to think is the most essential thing. Okay, and the Buddha was sure that freedom of thought was the only way to the discovery of truth. Now you see, I told you that this book is modeled so beautifully and everything is taken care of, including how we can think clearly. Now see this verse number 22. I'm going to read it again. Man must know the truth and real truth. To him, freedom of thought was the most essential thing. And he was sure that freedom of thought was the only way to the discovery of truth. And the verse number 23. infallibility of the Vedas meant complete denial of freedom of thought. You see how beautifully Baba Saheb Ambedkar has laid down the four theses of Brahmanism, and how he's now coming from the Buddhist side and trying to, challenge those things from the grounds that, we can see very clearly that freedom of thought. That's why we can say that in the Vedas and Hinduism, there is no freedom of thought. In the Brahminical philosophy, there is no freedom of thought. You have to accept whatever is written in the sacred books. I think that is same about the religions which are based on the books, that you have to believe everything that is said in the sacred books. On the other hand, Buddhism never asked you, the Buddha never asked his followers to believe in his sacred books. He said even the Tripitakas are questionable. And we know the famous Kalam Sutra where Buddha has asked the Kalamas to test everything, like the goldsmith will test the gold. Now, for these reasons, this thesis of Brahmanic philosophy was most obnoxious to him, because Buddha was a lover of freedom. If Buddha was anything, he was a lover of freedom. He loved freedom. He wanted people to have freedom of mind. His mind was free. He was free to think. He was free to be creative. Now the second tenet. Now this is the first tenet that the Buddha dealt with, that the Vedas are infallible, because if we say something is infallible, not questionable, then it goes against the freedom of thought, freedom of expression. The second is very interesting, that if you want to have the salvation of the soul, you have to practice Vedic sacrifices. Buddha denied this. He said that there was no virtue in sacrifice. He said, if you sacrifice, the Buddha also talked about very figuratively, because Buddha borrowed in a sense of those images and said, what is the real sacrifice? So when you work for others, when you do something good for others, that's the real sacrifice. Not killing of the animals, not killing of the human beings, not wasting resources is the sacrifice. So Buddha had no problem in denying or opposing the second tenet or thesis of the Brahmanic philosophy. Verse number 26 is very important. Sacrifice in the sense of self-denial for the good of others be called true sacrifice. What is the true sacrifice? The true sacrifice is in the sense of self-denial for the good of others is called true sacrifice. Sacrifice in the sense of killing an animal as an offering to God for personal benefit is regarded as a false sacrifice. Now see, verse number 28 is very, very powerful. See verse number 28. The opponents of sacrifices used to ridicule the Brahmins by saying, what? If one man can go to heaven by sacrificing an animal, why should not one sacrifice one's own father? That would be a quicker way of going to heaven. If sacrificing others, killing others can lead you to the heaven, then why don't you make the ultimate sacrifice of killing your own father so that you will attain to the heaven quickly? So now the doctrine of Chaturvarna, which is the third thesis of the Brahmanical philosophy, Buddha didn't like at all. And we know that the Buddha has launched a criticism of the Chaturvarna. We can read it. It's very self-explanatory, but I think I'm going to just touch upon a few things here, particularly verse number 32. Inequality exists in every society. It is not that the inequality doesn't exist in every society, but it was different with Brahmanism. The inequality preached by Brahmins was its official doctrine. See, inequality is a part of all the societies. Everywhere you see inequalities, okay? But to preach it as an official doctrine is something very obnoxious. That, okay, that, inequality has to be there. That is the official doctrine. It was not mere a growth. Brahmanism did not believe in equality. In fact, it was opposed to equality. So you see this we are going to look at this, the Buddha's criticism of Chaturvarna. But if you look at verse number 37, on a careful review of the rules of Chaturvarna, the Buddha had no difficulty in coming to the conclusion that the philosophic foundations on which the social order was reared by Brahmanism were wrong, if not selfish. They were not only wrong, but also selfish. It was clear to him that it did not serve the interest of all, much less did it advance the welfare of all. Indeed, it was deliberately designed to make many serve the interest of the few. You can underline this. What is Brahmanism? It was deliberately designed to make many serve the interest of the few. In it, man was made to serve a class of self-styled supermen. Self-styled supermen. Okay. It was calculated to suppress and exploit the weak and to keep him in a state of complete subjugation. And the law of karma, the fourth tenet of the Brahmanic philosophy, the Buddha thought, was calculated to sap the spirit of revolt completely. Because who you are, whatever you are, is because of your karma. You cannot do anything about it. It's not due to society. It's your karma that you are born an untouchable, that you are born a Shudra, that you are born a Kshatriya, you are born a Brahmin because of your karma. So, the verse number 41, the Shudras and women, the two classes whose humanity was most mutilated by Brahmanism, had no power to rebel against the system. Now, you see, people even cannot revolt when you arrange your religion in such a way that people do not have that power to revolt. And then when you look at this, that we understand the revolution that Baba Saheb Ambedkar wanted to bring in. Now, I think this part 5 is so important for us to understand, because it gives us an idea of the kind of society that was present at the time of the Buddha and the philosophical systems that were put forth. Now, having said this, as I told you in the previous classes, that Brahmanism was not the dominant philosophy of the time. It was existing here and there. There were many philosophical schools at the time of the Buddha, and there were 62 schools which were not Brahmanical schools, and there were 6 which were opposed to Brahmanical schools. And then we have seen at length the Sankhya philosophy that Buddha has really admired. So we can see that, it's not what has been told to us, the monotonous view of the history, that we can look at the vibrant ancient India at the time of the Buddha. So many things were happening, so many things were going on, so many thought processes were there, so many people were philosophizing, and so many people were coming with new thoughts. So this was about the Brahmanas, and we have seen the 4 tenets of Brahmanas and how Buddha didn't like the 4 tenets of the Brahmanas. We can say that Buddha was the opponent of the Chaturvarna Dharma. Buddha was the opponent of the so-called the philosophy of transmigration of soul. The Buddha was opposed that people can realize something by serving the Brahmins, and Buddha was deadly against accepting anything as the sacrosanct or something sacred which cannot be questioned. Now, if we understand it, we can begin to get a glimpse of the Buddha's philosophy also, because then we can compare. As I told you, that comparison is a very good tool for us to understand something. So that's what we have to go back to this chapter on the Brahmanas. And now I'm going to come to the 4th section of the part 5th, which is about the Upanishads. And I'm going to read straightway through it, because there is nothing to explain. It is self-explanatory. So please bear with me for a few minutes and listen carefully. The Upanishads and their teachings, because we hear about the Upanishads often, and Upanishads where are so many. There is also Allah Upanishad. Then there is a Mandukya Upanishad, Mundak Upanishad. There are Katha Upanishad. There is a very old one, Brihaspati Upanishad or something like that. So people have been talking that, there is a big philosophy in Upanishad and all. So let's look at, how Baba Saheb Ambedkar looks at the Upanishads. The Upanishads and their teachings. The Upanishads constituted another piece of literature. It is not part of the Vedas. It is uncanonical. So Vedas and Upanishads. So Upanishads are not part of the Vedas. All the same, they did form a part of religious literature. But Upanishads are also part of the religious literature. In Annihilation of Caste, Baba Saheb Ambedkar says that there might be a possibility of reforming Hinduism based on Upanishads. We don't know what, we have to explore the philosophy of Upanishads. But now let's look at these two pages here. All the same, they did form a part of religious literature. 3. The number of Upanishads is quite large, some important, some quite unimportant. Some of them were ranged against the Vedic theologians, the Brahmanic priests. It said that the Upanishads are written by the Kshatriyas or Shramanas, and they are opposed to Brahmanism, Brahmin priests. All of them agreed in viewing Vedic study as a study of nescience or ignorance. 6. They were all agreed in their estimate of the 4 Vedas and Vedic science as the lower knowledge. So the people who practiced the teachings of the Upanishad, they thought that the Vedas are the lower knowledge. They are not the highest knowledge. They were all agreed in questioning the divine origin of the Vedas. The Upanishads questioned the divine origin of the Vedas. They were all agreed in denying the efficacy attributed to sacrifices, to the funeral oblations, and the gifts of the priest, which are fundamentals of the Brahmanic philosophy. This, however, was not the main topic with which the Upanishads were concerned. Their discussions centered around Brahman and Atman. Atma se Paramatma ka milan. That is the basic doctrine of Upanishads, that your Atma should unite with the Paramatma. So what is the Paramatma? Is a Brahman, is a Brahma. And that's why you see all these different schools like Prajapati, Brahma Kumari, and so on and so forth. So this is very interesting. This knowledge is very interesting to understand the contemporary religious landscape in India as well. So if you really grasp this section of the Buddha and Dhamma, you can understand what's going on all around our country in terms of the so-called Hindu religion today. So they were all agreed in denying the efficacy and attributed to sacrifices, to the funeral oblations, and the gifts to the priest, which are the fundamentals of the Brahmanic philosophy. But we know that this is not the basic topic of the Upanishads. Their basic concern was centered around Brahman and Atman. Brahman was all-pervading principle which binds the universe, and that salvation lay in the Atman realizing that it is Brahman. So there is a Brahman everywhere, and your salvation, you will be free when you realize that your Atma is the Brahma. It is also called Brahmism. Brahmism, in a sense that Baba Ambedkar said that this is the highest democratic principle. If you can believe that everybody is a Brahma, there is no difference between the human being. That can be the highest democratic principle. But we know that the Brahmanism is completely opposed to this principle that everybody is equal, everybody is having, this Atman, and Atman is the same. The main thesis of the Upanishad was that Brahman was the reality and Atman was the same as Brahman. The Atman did not realize that it was Brahman because of the upadhis. Because the Brahman has the upadhis, the Atman has the upadhis, therefore it cannot realize its ultimate nature. So there is this entanglement within the Atman. Because of it cannot realize its Brahman as a reality. The question was, now listen carefully, the verse number 12. The question was, is Brahman a reality? The acceptance of the Upanishadic thesis depended upon the answer to this question. Is Brahman a reality? Now everybody talks about Brahma, and Buddha has in one sutra has talked about very nicely that everybody says that Brahma. So he asked the question that have you seen the Brahma? He says no. Has your father seen the Brahma? He says no. He says, has your father's father has seen the Brahma? Says, no. It goes up to the 7th generation, and he says, okay, nobody has seen the Brahma. You are admitting that your father, his father has not seen the Brahma. That means you are like one blind leading the another blind. Okay. So now is Brahman a reality? That was a question which was asked. So the acceptance of the Upanishadic thesis depended upon the answer to this question. Okay, what is Brahman a reality? The Buddha could find no proof in support of the thesis that Brahman was a reality. He therefore rejected the thesis of the Upanishads. It is not that the question on this issue were not put to the authors of the Upanishads, they were. So this question was asked, what is Brahman? Such questions were put to no less a person than Yajnavalkya, a great seer who plays so important a part in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. It's the oldest Upanishad. It's said to be the oldest Upanishad. And the question and the hero of that Upanishad is Yajnavalkya, the great seer. So he was asked this question, what is Brahman? What is Brahman? He was asked this question, what is Atman? All that Yajnavalkya could say, Neti, Neti, I know not, I know not. It is said that when he was saying this, his two wives were there. And then he left his home. I don't know what is the context of it, but when he uttered this, his two wife was there. One of the comic take on this is that he wanted to, go away from this entanglement of the two wives, something like that. So Yajnavalkya was asked this question, what is a Brahman? And he said, I know not, Neti, Neti. And this is very celebrated in the Brahmanical philosophy, Neti, Neti. Is celebrated so much. And, if you ask a question, what is this? And Neti, Neti, I don't know. So now the last verse of this section is 17. How can anything be reality about which no one knows anything? Asked the Buddha. He had therefore no difficulty in rejecting the Upanishadic thesis as being based on pure imagination. So I would take a pause here, and because this is very much familiar ground to us, but there is a lot that Baba Ambedkar has put in a few pages about the Brahmanas, Vedas, Upanishads, and I think we need to really have a little bit discussion on it. So let's open the class for the discussion. Hello?
You're not audible, Mangesh.
Okay. Am I audible now?
Yeah.
So Nikhil says people can unmute themselves and ask and discuss, reflect, comment on. See, that's the beauty of Buddhism, that you see it as a context. It is laid down in a particular fashion, that it gives on, it keeps on giving you a clarity about a lot of things, about the society, about philosophy, and then it situates the Buddha's Dhamma. And as I was reflecting on this part of the Buddha and his Dhamma, that Buddha and his Dhamma, it's not the it's not only about the Dhamma, it is about the Buddha. So we cannot appreciate the Dhamma without the personality of the Buddha, the personality of the founder. And likewise, I was thinking that in our society, so much of a confusion, so many things goes on. People keep on talking, arguing back and forth about certain things, certain concepts. I think the only way to come out of this confusion in the society is to look at the personality of Baba Saheb Ambedkar. And that's why life and mission of the Baba Saheb Ambedkar is very important. Reading about him, understanding him, what he would have done, how he would have thought, how he would have responded. Because what I am realizing these days is that there is so much talk in the society, so many ideas are thrown back and forth, and so many things are happening. But I think the great guide for us is not knowledge itself, because of course we are the knowledge seekers and we seek knowledge, but we have that the personality of Baba Saheb Ambedkar among us. So whatever philosophical argument discussions we have, I think the ultimate guiding point for us is the life and the mission of Baba Saheb Ambedkar. And that's what we see in here in the Buddha and his Dhamma. The way Baba Saheb Ambedkar has modeled the Buddha and his Dhamma, you see continuously he goes back to the Buddha as a human being, as a personality. And we will see how Baba Saheb Ambedkar has situated him. Now here, we see almost Buddha speaking through Baba Saheb Ambedkar. He's arguing with the Brahmins, he's arguing with those who are having wrong views. And I think that's the beauty when we look at the Buddha and his Dhamma, because a lot of people have a lot of questions. They switch on to reading a lot of books, which I encourage personally that people should read the books and even read Tripitaka and whatnot. Even they should read Tibetan text and Sanskrit text and whatnot. We shouldn't stop anybody from doing anything or practicing in any system. But now these days, I think that if we want to bring Buddhism back to a country, the only way through which it is possible is through the Buddhism. The more we grasp, the more we understand this broad framework and very clear framework that Baba Ambedkar has given to us, then everything falls in place. Otherwise, we tend to become, very extremist. We either go this direction or we go that direction. We try to say that my view is true, that view is wrong, and so on and so forth. So why I'm bringing up this in the discussion is because you see, Baba Sahib foresaw all this. So he has to give us a book which will give us answer to all the questions. I'm not saying that it's like a omniscient book. It's not something that that answers everything in a sense of omniscience. What I'm trying to get it at, the situation that we are in, the situation of the revival of Buddhism, the annihilation of caste, building up of the community, ending the discrimination, forging that kind of a cultural revolution. I think this book is the source on which we can model everything.
Mangesh Bhai, I'm
Banu, yes.
Yeah, so it's very good, Mangesh Bhai. I think I have in connection actually whatever this Atman, I have more questions on this rebirth, and I read the rebirth part of this book, and I understood in my knowledge. And maybe when we get chance, I can share it. If there is no other discussion, I just wanted to take your inputs. I just prepared one slide on what I understood from Buddha and his Dhamma on the rebirth. If time is there, I would like to share and discuss. Otherwise, I will open it for others on this subject.
But what we will do, as we have planned, Alka-Tai, you and a few others, let's have a session on this, and so that we can have a comprehensive discussion.
Yes, yeah.
So what I would request you and others to hold on with these thoughts. I would request you to really come up with your presentations, and we will have a session on that.
Okay.
Because my take on this is very clear. Buddha has classified certain matters as achinteya. Achinteya means you cannot just grasp them with your thinking. It's not that you cannot grasp them, you can grasp them. But some matters are achinteya, like, the matter of karma is achinteya. Okay. Yeah. The Buddha didn't deny that it's not possible to answer, but he said that with your mere thinking, you cannot grasp certain things.
Yeah. What I was mentioning is, what you mentioned is 100% correct. But I just summarized what is only written in this book actually. Not beyond this for now. Okay. And the reason why I'm bringing this is, argument, like when you go argument with others. Nowadays, I am seeing even here also a lot of people going for arguments, and they're not able to justify, because this is one of the key subject. Like especially, let me tell the reason, especially at least in Maharashtra, it is second generation of Buddhism. At least people aware of what is the reality. But if you take a layman, normal people who are uneducated or educated, both people also, where the Buddhism is not reaching, I personally feel is the death actually. See, even in let me tell my example from my village. Even I know about Buddhism only from you in 2001 because of Buddhist circle. Otherwise, I might be really deviated from the reality. And the trigger point for me, I will tell, in my village, when I was childhood, we have only one stone as the goddess for our network people. We only give my grandparents used to go there to that stone and say to take care of the problems, whatever is coming in the village. That is the only hope they have, and that is a tradition they followed. And unfortunately or fortunately, my father is having, he studied, even though my grandparents are uneducated. In my childhood onwards, my father has some knowledge on Buddha and Ambedkar. And we have a pictures in our house of both Buddha and Ambedkar from our childhood, LKG, I can say.
Madhu, you tell native place. What is the, because many people might not be knowing from where you come from.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So I am basically from a small village, remote village close to Vijayawada, where we don't even have proper electricity when we are childhood. Maybe after my fifth standard, I think we have electricity. So that is a place I came up. And there, this is the tradition we have in our villages. But good part in my village I noticed is they used to follow the ethics. Even my parents, my grandparents, and they are very strong physically because they used to do hard work and eat less. Because of that, their physical energy is very high. But unfortunately, their mindsets are not matured because they don't know really what is Buddha. Even I was doing puja along with other gods. Buddha also, we used to think he is a god along with other gods. And what I know at that my childhood is that Panchashela, never lie, never misbehave, all those things. Only 5 points we know, never eat non-veg. That's it. Beyond that, we don't know whether a real god or not. My debate on this started only in our Buddhist circle in 2001 when I posted some question on this rebirth. And then I got chance to interact with you in detail on this, and then Satish KIG. That triggered me. See, my assumption till that point is when somebody is dead, emotional, how it is happening. I will tell in the village level how people think. So now somebody is dead in a family. Then what people are getting is suddenly they are getting depressed. Even myself, I can say, okay, what is happening to this person after death? And moreover, equally the good people and bad people both are dying, and good people are more targeted actually. So then what is happening? Then why God is, the ultimate assumption is when he dead, God will take care of him and he goes to his next phase. That is how they concluded. To come out of the depression, they are gaining energy from this God, whichever is created. Unfortunately, as a literature is not there, they are believing still God is there to take care of all those things. That is how I think people are, when somebody is lost in the family, they are not able to digest how to fill that gap in that family. So that is the reason the God is playing a key role, especially in my places. And initially only Buddhism and Hinduism there, but unfortunately at the age of my 25, I can say there used to be only one temple in our village, that is the stone temple, especially for our network, that we call it as water goddess. After that, what happened is within 20 years, slowly 2 temples came, Ramalayam and one other one more. Just we are only 300 houses close to at that time. But shocking news for me is by the age of my 35, there are 6 churches came in our village. And now my house is in such a situation that I have to close all the doors. Morning 4 o'clock, they will put that mic in our villages, and they only pray for the God actually. And the reason for them is they think that the God will come and take care of their problems. When that is where I think Buddhism why not reached is when people are knowing little bit. Christianity, they projected that God is taken care, and they reached all the villages just to give some moral support and also some little bit of money, 2,000 rupees, 1,000 rupees, small helps. Then slowly they started understanding and getting motivated towards it. Now most of the people who are practicing that is more religious than who is practicing Hinduism actually. So that is where I think everybody is totally connected to God, and they are not able to come out of it. For that, the justification is, as per Buddha, what is the consequence of death actually. So nobody is addressing it. Even this question I was asking, even I started asking from you, then I got little clarity at that time. Then I learned this Thailand monastery here in America in 2014. And there, after I did 4 months course of meditation and logical thinking of Buddha's teachings. And I really learned the root level. I asked the monk the same question at that time. And the monk told that if you meditate for long hours, you may be able to see you in the future. But he told by the time you come back to normal stage, you cannot remember. But only for monks, there is a possibility. Then I told I'm getting emotional when somebody is dying. What should I do? Then he gave me one example of virtual meditation. The virtual meditation is like when you meditate, just think of your forefathers, age groups for 5 minutes, and the same age group. Within the family, 4 or 5 age groups you take and virtually imagine them and dedicate your merits, whatever you are doing, good deeds. That is how he told to practice. Then I was doing that virtual meditation. Thereafter, when somebody died, I just imagine in my mind saying, when he is dead, whatever the good I am doing, please get some positive energy from that. Still, I am not convinced, but only I came to India in 2016. Then I went to one of the Buddhist conference in Chennai. There are 5,000 people came, and with more anxiety of this question, I went there and asked Vinay Rakita. I think he is the monk main speaker in that conference. And I asked him the same question. He also didn't answer me directly. He asked me to read the book. As per his knowledge, he mentioned The Essence of Buddhism, written by Rahul Velpala, translated from Pali to English by Ambedkar. So that is the reliable source I can tell you. Then I read that book with more anxiety, and within that there is a 2 pages of content. I think I'm taking more time. Probably this subject. If you
Yes,
want
Bhanu,
to
I
continue,
think. Yes, Bhanu, I think because this is not what we are trying to discuss today, and
yes.
because our topic is, let's stay focused on the current topic that we are discussing, because we are now discussing about. As I told you, there is a scope for all this. We have a conference where you can all bring all these things, and I think that is the way to deal with, because we will otherwise derail from the topic today.
Yeah, definitely, Mangesh. I agree with you. Yeah. Because
we will deal with it. I am very keen on having this discussion with you all, and I think whatever you are saying makes a lot of sense to a lot of people. And
he is ready with the paper. He sent me also.
Yes. So, Alka madam, let's do it very soon, and maybe next week or so, and let's keep targeting on this.
Please.
What we are discussing. It's very good reflection, Bhanubhai, and I am very keen to hear you. Yes, definitely. Sunny, you want to say something, Sunny? Though the Upanishads were fallible, rejected by Buddha, the fact of the matter is Brahmin failed to provide spiritual equivalent to masses. Even despite accepting the nature of things. Okay, that's a comment. Doesn't appear as it is illusion. Samiksha, you raised your hand. Hello?
Yes, sir. Jai Bhim, sir.
Okay.
I just wanted to reflect on whatever we have discussed on these Vedas and Upanishads. So, Upanishads, like in Hindu religion, there is no sense of humanity, but some Hindus take side of the Upanishads, and they proudly say that God is all pervading, and that is the basic principle of their religion. But Baba Saheb says that whatever they are saying, their theory cannot be the basic principle of the religion, because the religion is directly concerned with the behavior of man in the society. So whatever they are saying is the basic principle of the science. So, sir, if you can also throw some light on the principle of the science and principle of the religion. So just this point I wanted to reflect. And as they say that this is the basic principle of their religion, but whatever their acts are, they are completely opposite. So whatever they utter and whatever they act are completely opposite things. So these things I wanted to reflect on this Upanishads part, and what was Baba Saheb's take on that. He mentions this in Path to Salvation also. So I just referring your talk and just relating with whatever his explanation on Upanishads part in that. So that was my reflection, sir.
Good. Sunny?
Yes, sir. Hello.
Hello, Sunny.
So, I mean, all this talk about Upanishads being very, I mean, as it is considered by caste Hindus that it is very enlightening in nature, whatever has been discussed in it. So the thing is, these concepts, this Atman, Brahman, the illusion of thing, Maya. So, I mean, if I mean, all of these things, I mean, if they are accepting all these things, then they should have rejected the Varna system and caste system, because they, I mean, it itself says that things do not appear as it is. So this idea of caste, that someone is lower, I mean, it is a contradiction in itself, that you are already, I mean, declaring someone that is not fit for the spiritual, I mean, I mean, duties and all. Yeah. So that is what I just wanted to say.
You know, this concept of Maya, because if you look at the history of ideas in this country, the intellectual history of this country, you come to Kumarila and Shankara. And Shankara has brought these concepts of Maya, of course, stealing from Buddhism, that whatever appears to you is not what exactly it is. That's a basic, teaching of the Buddha, that you have to explore. You cannot just trust your senses. You have to go deeper than your sensual experience. And so there is a story that this guy is preaching that, there is Atma everywhere and like that. So once he was taking a bath in a pool, and one, I think, outcast entered into that. And he was so furious. The Shankara was so furious that, he felt that he's polluted. So you see this, if you accept that everybody has a Brahma, everybody is the same. Baba Ambedkar also says this, that, if you believe in this philosophy, that Brahma is in everywhere, in every person, then, that is the highest democratic principle. You cannot get more democratic principle from that. But what happens in actuality, they are just words, they are metaphysics.
Exactly.
Their metaphysics and their ethics doesn't go hand in hand. You see what I'm saying? So this is a dissonance. This is sort of I would say intellectual dishonesty. This is sort of, so that's why it is called a ploy. It's a mechanism to keep people in the servitude.
I mean, even Shankaracharya, even this Advaita Vedanta and the dualistic, I mean, all of these talks that the Atman reality, and even though in his Brahma Sutra that he still, spills quite toxic talks about Shudras and all. They should not be allowed to read. I mean, boiled this glass should be poured. So all of that talk, and after that, these ridiculous, talks about not granting spiritual right, and that to dehumanizing them. I mean, it is hypocrisy on another level, actually.
Yeah. That's very much so. And, we need to articulate it more and more, Sunny.
Okay.
We have another 4-5 minutes to go, and no, I would request you all to go through this part again and again, because then you get so much of clarity. As I was telling you in the previous classes, that Baba Ambedkar has read who won't write anything without going into the depth of the matters. So whatever Baba Ambedkar has written here, I'm not saying that it's infallible, because that is going against his own dictum, but he gives us a very potent summary of everything. So if you take up this argument with anybody, I think you won't be wrong. If you have what is the Brahmana and this is niti, then you can say, if you say I know not, this is not is it, this is not what it is, then how do you know something, isn't it? So it's like anti-knowledge. Their system is anti-knowledge. Their system is anti-understanding. While the first thing Buddha will ask us to inquire, to look into things, to understand. All right, I think people, if you have no further questions, then we can talk a little bit about Bhanu and Alka madams and whoever wants to participate in the upcoming conference on karma and rebirth. Okay.
Yeah, next 8-10 days we can take.
10 days. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm trying to find out some people who can speak on it. So, let's have like 8-10 people and, 20 minutes each, and we can do it a nice conference.
Yeah, Mangesh. I think we should have a screen sharing, Mangesh, for that session. Let them prepare some deck so that we should not deviate from, because when they put words, we deviate the discussion. Exactly. If it is a flow diagram, I think everybody will stick to that, and it gives more productive debate.
That would be great.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
So if there is nothing on your mind, the next class will be more interesting, and next to next class will be another interesting thing, and that's how we will be finishing our book 1 of the 8 books. So we will be almost reaching 1/8 of the Buddha and his Dhamma in another 2 sessions. So if we pursue for at least half a year or maybe more than that, I'm sure that we will be able to have a thorough reading of the Buddha and his Dhamma. So should we end today?
Mangesh bhai, can I ask some
please,
on a different topics?
Please.
Not related to this class, but I know you used to visit Sri Lanka so many times.
Yes.
So in US, I have seen so many Sri Lankan temples, almost all.
Yeah.
I don't see any women monks in their their tradition or from their countries. So is there something there, or is just the security purpose only?
No, actually, this Bhikkhuni tradition is lost everywhere. There is no Bhikshuni tradition. And Sri Lanka tried to revive it, but they do not have also, they are called mothers, Ani or Ai, something like that. So actually what has happened is, we have spoken about this in another sessions, is that the Buddhism has totally become the patriarchal system, the male dominated, androcentric, and that too monk-centric religion. And I think that is the greater harm to Buddhism if it remains so, male-centric and androcentric, and that too, the celibate-centric. It is not that, all the 4 parisa, Chatu parisa, which is called, Bhikkhu, Bhikkhuni, Upasaka, Upasika, they are all they form the Buddhist Sangha. So today, the concept of the Sangha is just Bhikkhu Sangha, and which is really harming Buddhism more than anything, I think. And in Sri Lanka, there is no Bhikshuni ordination, very rare. In Thailand, I know one Bhikkhuni, Dhammananda Bhikkhuni, and her mother, she revolted and she took the ordination. And I reckon that now there are few. Once I stayed in the Bhikkhuni Vihar in near Bangkok. So but in Mahayana countries, like particularly Taiwan, there are a lot of nuns, lots and lots of nuns.
Yeah, Taiwan, and then even Chinese and Vietnam. Yeah, so Vietnam I see so many.
Very many nuns, and in Tibet they don't have nuns. Very strange. So I think in India we have to reverse it. We have to find our own way, and I think we don't have to hold on to these dichotomies of. We have to take Sangha as one Sangha in a sense that we have to think about it very carefully, how we can do it. That is a bigger question of how we can organize the Buddhist into a kind of a Sangha. A big question. But I know that, the women, this is the status of the thing right now, Naresh bhai.
Okay, good. Yeah, the last weekend, there was a Kathina ceremony in one of the Sri Lankan temples. They bought the whole church, new church. So we had almost like 40 monks and even Sri Lankan Consulate General was also there. And I asked him, I said, I don't see a single a lady monk here. And he could not give the answer. So, yeah, I think in India, at least we have some. So we see here and there, but
it will come up. It will come up. I think
in Santa Clara there are ayas, bhikkhunis.
Yeah. In Santa Clara, yes, I have been to that forest monastery there. The Americans, the 2, 3 are there now.
But when the monks are on this which branch,
Sri
Lankan, they don't have bhikkhunis.
Yes, that's right.
I will just take this last question of Umesh, and he needs a guidance on Buddha perspective to read and understand the concept laid in Buddha and his Dhamma. I think as we were discussing in the previous section, let's engage with whatever text is available to us. So we have the Buddha and his Dhamma. Let's engage with it. Let's read it thoroughly, and whenever we get time, digest the concept, understand it. And I think the basic attitude that we need to do is, the Buddha has given the example as to how the Dhamma can be studied. So he said that, he has given the example of the ball. So if you have a ball and if you want to put water in it, and if it's already filled, then it cannot take more water. So some people are like that. They are already filled up. So no water can go into that. Then there are some people whose pot is leaked. So the more water you put, it leaks down. So sometimes we are like leaking pots. And some people are like, their pots are poisoned. So whatever water you put into that, it already gets, prejudiced according to their whims and their ways of thinking. So I think what we need to do, and there are other ways. I'm going to come to that as to how we can study the Dhamma. One way of studying the Dhamma is to keep the understanding that there is a suffering and we have to end it. So have that intention of how we can end the suffering. So study the Dhamma from that point of view. Then study the Dhamma as anicca. Anicca in a sense that everything changes. So what concept you understand today, it's subjected to change tomorrow. So the principle of anicca. And the third principle of studying the Dhamma is anatta. Like, it's not myself. It is not me. It's like the Dhamma is something anatta. And it can be a communal exploration. It can be, it cannot be owned as such. So I think this is the second way by which attitude you can look at the Dhamma. The third is the simile of raft, that the Buddha said that my Dhamma is like a raft. It has to be used. It has to be applied. And the fourth is the Dhamma is like a snake. If you grasp it wrongly, it might bite you. So how to grasp the correct principles correctly? Because if you even cling on to the Buddha's principles, it might be counterproductive to us. So I think there are many ways. I will write something on it and I will send you, Umesh. Okay. Okay, then we end for today and see you next week.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.